Great. So welcome to this session where we'll debate, we'll discuss challenge-led innovation from the UK and beyond. Just to introduce myself, I'm Colan Mehaffey. I'm Head of Data and Digital Innovation with Cardiff Capital Region. Been in the region about 18 months. I moved from Scotland where I was CEO of a data-driven Institute for Health and Social Care. One of the reasons I moved to South Wales was to work with Cardiff Capital Region. It's worth setting a little bit of context because really, it was great to meet Gareth and the team who were involved in Challenge. We're a city deal. Challenge has no right to be in a city deal. And it speaks to the different approach we've had to take in this region to try and generate innovation-led inclusive growth. And I was thinking about the session that we're having just now, this debate we're going to have, and I was reflecting on actually someone who Elvira mentioned, Dan Bresnitz, who wrote Innovation in Real Places, and I read an interview with him recently. And I'll read you a quick quote as a sort of starter for time for the session before we go into the panel. But Dan Bresnitz said, "We now live in the world of fake news and misconceptions, and too many people and organisations make too much money by selling myths about innovation. The purveyors of these myths, the religious believers of techno-fetishism, have a feeble understanding of the big picture of global production and innovation." Quite damning so far, but it gets better. Innovation is not just the invention of new shiny things. If it was, it would have a feeble effect on economic growth and welfare. We should care about innovation, and this is the important bit, because it is the only way to ensure sustained long-term economic and human welfare growth, not because it is new or cool. The greatest opportunities for growth lie in communities recognising their own advantages. So it's with great pleasure we have four experts who are going to expand on this and talk about real examples perhaps from around the globe. We've got Cathy Nothstine from Nesta, Howell Davies from Interface Online, Martin Doherty from the Centre for Advanced Sustainable Energy, and Elvira, who you just met. I'll ask each of our panel in a moment to introduce themselves, talk a bit about their work, and then also perhaps a quick take on the topic that we're here to debate. And then I've got some areas I want us to work through. I'll do my best, Fiona Bruce, I can, but what I would suggest is after a panellist has spoken, if you have a question, pop your hand up, okay? So, great. So, look, I'll start with Howell, nearest to me, if that's okay. Howell, if you want to take a couple, 3 minutes to introduce yourself and then also to talk a little bit about your work to set some context and what your take is on what you've heard so far.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Colin. My name's Howell Davies. I think my approach is going to be more a bottom-up approach. Some of it's going to be around that implementation piece as well, rather than the policy level and top-down. So I went up to Scotland. I'm from Wales originally, but went up to Scotland to do salmon, and then I went into the enterprise agencies, and I'm now with Interface. Interface has been going since 2005. It's funded through the Scottish Funding Council, who fund all our universities and colleges, but it's also partly funded through the enterprise agencies as well, so it has that sort of company focus on it. There's a team of business engagement people. I think there's about 10 of them. There's 2 in the Highlands, someone in Aberdeen, someone in Dumfries and Galloway. And Elvira's map earlier on about the, I think you're showing the GVA per income. It's very true with us that actually there's so many different areas. You look at Edinburgh and Glasgow, there's a lot of tech going on. Aberdeen, you've got oil and gas and engineering. But some of the Highlands, the focus or the priorities is more around community-based innovation. So, having people on the ground with that understanding and also that flexibility in terms of the outcomes we're looking for is really important for us. Alongside that, over the last 12 years, I've worked on the sector side of things, and I've had sort of food and drink, creative industries and tourism have been sort of sector teams that I've had. We've kind of aligned ourselves where we've got innovation centres within Scotland. We've kind of aligned ourselves where the innovation centres weren't necessarily there, so we weren't too much getting in each other's way. What we've had since 2008, though, is an innovation voucher scheme. So these are £5,000 vouchers that help companies with that initial funded academic collaboration. So it's that first time dipping your toe in the water. I was talking earlier to Martin, £5,000 actually isn't that much anymore, so actually maybe we need to look at sort of trying to double that and maybe sort of reduce the numbers that we sort of try and get, just so that you get more impact and a bit more activity going on. so far, since 2008, we've done 1,830 innovation vouchers. We've also got a range, so we've got a student placement innovation voucher, which can be a follow-on, and then there's a workforce innovation voucher. And if we're talking about sort of the effectiveness of what works and what doesn't, I was looking at the numbers. The workforce innovation voucher, I think it's been 17, because people just don't understand what it means. It's a bit nebulous. There's not enough direction in what we're actually looking for in that scheme. But following on that, we've got a follow-on innovation voucher, which is now called an advanced innovation voucher, which is funded through Scottish Enterprise, so the Enterprise Agency, where you're, unlike the 5K, where you only have to put in a bit of cash contribution, in-kind contribution, you're expected to be putting in cash contribution, so it's a bit more investment, a bit more serious, where you can get up to 20,000 of funding, and you can match it with 20K, so it's a £40,000 project. But they are looking a lot more at the impacts around jobs and so on as well. They want their value for money with what they're asking for. When COVID hit, one of the things I was tasked with was going out there and understanding where we could support with recovery, where there might be money coming in that we could actually distribute in an effective way from an innovation perspective. So started to go around the houses with the different sectors. We went to tourism. They weren't interested. They were looking at much either direct money straight into the companies, or they were looking at infrastructure, for example. So food and drink, who's one of my allies, sort of one of my real allies then, we went to them. Initially we said, could we set up an innovation fund, help companies with what they're doing next? They weren't interested until we kind of understood actually what they were looking at is the net zero piece. So as soon as we went, right, okay, can we look at a net zero fund with you? Managed to get, and some of this is maybe small fry compared to some of the money you're talking about, but 200,000 there to them to do 20 projects around net zero. And one of the things we were looking at, we didn't want to focus too much on, I suppose we could have gone for, right, how do we reduce as much carbon from the atmosphere as possible, and gone, right, okay, let's look at the big distilleries, let's look at farming, for example. But this was about trying to develop a whole lot of case studies which would inspire other food companies as well to work with universities, but work on, but they could understand. So with the whiskey companies, look at carbon reduction or carbon capture. Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. The whiskey company. I see him waving. I couldn't quite work out. So with that, it was around a range of case studies that we wanted to deliver. One of the other things we've done is with the Inward Investment Catalyst Fund. So we're talking about the challenge funds, and I think I'm answering later questions here. But with the challenge funds, sometimes you look at the language. So we've got Inward Investment Catalyst Fund, which is about companies from out with Scotland working with Scottish academics on R&D projects. So it could be a feasibility study if they are looking at coming into Scotland, which then hopefully gets them understanding what Scotland's about, what the opportunities are in Scotland, that they'll eventually base some R&D or they'll base some manufacturing actually in Scotland as well. But calling it a challenge fund probably focuses it too much, whereas actually you call it a catalyst fund. It's about, okay, do a bit of work, and then let's see where it goes from there. So I think that's probably, I'll probably leave it at that for now, if that's okay. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you. So, Elvira, we've heard from you, so maybe just pass to Cathy then to introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your work, your background. Cathy, if that's okay.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for having me here today. It's good to see the progress of the Cardiff Challenge Fund, given all the years that I know it's been in development. I think it's really, really impressive, really exciting. My name is Cathy. I'm the head of Future Cities at Challenge Works, which is a part of Nesta. We're an independent unit within Nesta, which some of you might know Nesta as the UK's innovation foundation that works on solving pressing problems using a variety of methods, challenges and challenge prizes, challenge funds being one of those. So within Nesta, we're called Challenge Works. We are a social enterprise. We're focused on designing and running open innovation competitions, working across a variety of sectors in a variety of settings in the UK and abroad. We've been in existence for about a decade, and over that time, we've run about 80 challenges and distributed around £100 million in funding. And I'll use the word challenge kind of interchangeably. I'm referring to both challenge funds and challenge prizes. We do both. So the way we're structured is that we partner with organizations, we partner with governments, we partner with charities, corporate foundations to identify pressing problems that aren't being solved kind of in traditional ways and that would benefit from a challenge-led or challenge-driven approach, and conduct the research and the design and the development and delivery of those challenges. The way we look at challenges is that they are ways to champion open innovation through competition. In their purest form, they're really quite simple. It's setting a problem, asking innovators to solve it, and then setting a reward for whoever solves it first, or solves it best according to a set of public, transparent, open criteria. They specify problems that need solving, but not the route that it takes to get there. So unlike grant funding, where there's a more clearly laid out path, challenges are outcome-based funding, so it's based on outcomes and it's based on how well those who enter it deliver the outcomes that are being sought, but it's not prescriptive about the path that innovators should take to get to those outcomes. The kind of the core feature of, say, a pure challenge prize or challenge fund is about offering an incentive. Usually that's thought of as a cash incentive, a large financial reward for whoever solves the problem. Some of the traditional like moonshot challenges and things like that, even going back to the early days of aviation, many of the transatlantic flights were structured as challenges, with a cash reward for whoever met the challenge first. We've found that running challenges with a stage gate approach is really beneficial. So rather than just setting a prize and saying whoever gets there first, gets the £1 million at the end or whatever it is, we found that there's a lot of benefit in using a stage gate approach and helping innovators along the way. So many of the challenges that we've run or other organizations have run that we admire use this stage gate approach of first supporting a promising cohort of entrants, perhaps giving some upfront funding in the form of seed grants, really helping the innovators along the journey. So in that sense, challenges often start to borrow features of accelerators or incubators in providing not just a little bit of funding up front, but also support to innovators, which could be things, often we're working with SMEs or startups or small entrepreneurs, so it might be business coaching, help with developing a business plan, help with kind of back office functions. It could also be mentoring, it could be training a particular element of whatever the challenge is focused on. So it could be more specific kind of technical capacity building. It could be access to information, access to data. We've run challenges that are structured around like a data test bed, or even you could use a physical test bed as part of the component, part of the incentive of entering a challenge. Isn't just the cash reward at the end, but it could be those other forms of non-financial support that innovators might find valuable, and might be a reason that they would enter, but then would also be that support that you're providing to innovators along the way to develop out their solution. The way that we, thinking about sort of why to run challenges, we think about 3 forms of impact that challenges can have. So the first being the solutions themselves, the innovations, the problem that needs solving that's not being solved, accelerating solutions. So what are the solutions being developed and how can that benefit the beneficiaries, the problem holders, the people who are affected by this problem that needs to be solved. So the first area of impact being the innovations themselves that the challenge is contributing to. The second area of impact that we think about is the innovators. So supporting innovators, like I said, we're often working with smaller companies, startups, and SMEs. So supporting innovators along that journey with developing out their business plan, developing out their business model. Challenges can be quite high profile in nature. So it's a good way to shine attention on the innovators. We hear from many of our companies that participate in our challenges that whether or not they go on to be the final winner, the participation and the profile raising that happens along the way is really, really helpful. It can help to raise investment, help them to build their networks, get access to other funders and other opportunities, and also to find other partners and some of that matchmaking element that comes into it. So that's all in that second category of supporting innovators. And then the third area of impact that we think about is systemic change. So I mentioned challenges can be quite high profile in nature, so can shine a spotlight on an issue, on a problem that maybe is being overlooked or is not being solved. They can, challenges are a good way to bring in a variety of stakeholders especially from public sector, policymakers, regulators. If it's about shaping a new technology or shaping a new market, then that's a great opportunity to use the challenge as a way to foster those kind of bigger conversations around policy change and regulatory change that needs to happen. A few other points I just thought I'd make quickly is about when a challenge works best, because we know, not every challenge needs to be solved. Not every problem needs to be solved by a challenge, of course. There's lots of different ways to do it. There's lots of different types of funding instruments and innovation methods out there. And so we think it's important to look closely at the type of challenge, the type of problem to be solved, and the characteristics of it that would lend itself well to a challenge. So something that's not being solved already, like I've mentioned, by sort of industry incumbents. Something, if you got a problem that you want to bring in fresh thinking, you want to bring in innovators from other fields, kind of unusual suspects, pair up expertise from different sectors to work together, can lend themselves to a challenge to accelerate progress on something that's just not happening already. And then another point about challenges is, from a funder's perspective, that they are a good way to leverage investment, because in the grand scheme of things, is actually not that much money for the funder compared to the investment that goes into it. And what I mean by that is that since the prize is structured around outcome-based funding, you only have to pay out, in theory, you only pay out for those that perform the best. It's a good way to get a lot of different people working on a problem and putting kind of their own resource into it and matching resource to solve an issue or to work in the sector. And then one last point that I'll say, bringing us back to Elvira's comments and thinking about place-based innovation, challenge-led innovation in a place-based context. So I mentioned I lead our work on cities, so that's about partnering with cities to run challenges is the way that we do it. So not about cities competing with one another, but more working with public sector agencies, local governments, to collaborate with the innovators to set a challenge and then work with innovators to co-create solutions in a way that brings in local perspective, local stakeholders, local community, as well as the local innovators. A couple of examples of times that we've done that. I know we're keen to kind of talk about some examples. So we've worked with the Mayor of London to run a series of challenges around post-COVID economic recovery. We've worked with the UN and in Sweden around a global challenge to work with cities around the world in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and creating climate-smart solutions in a way that's socially beneficial. All of the challenges that we run, like I mentioned, have this social benefit, kind of social angle to it. But so I'll stop there, but yeah, really excited to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And finally, Martin, do you want to just let us know who you are, give some of your background?
Okay, my name is Martin Doherty, and if you can't understand me, you can always ask Colan to translate. I'm a bit nervous, so I'll probably go quickly. I look after the Centre for Advanced Sustainable Energy. We are actually in our 10th year. We were initiated under the Northern Ireland Competence Centre programme, which was funded by Invest NI. It was EDRF funding. And it was designed essentially to bridge the valley of death in between TRLs 3 and 7, and it was to be an industry-led research centre, which we would marry industry with academics to fund research needs. Did it really turn out like that? Probably not. But it's probably what we would probably more accurately say that in the first 9 years of our life, we were an industry academic collaboration, and actually how we would address challenges in the Northern Ireland economy, and basically how we would decarbonise it or defossilise it, and how we could potentially grow not only our indigenous market, but obviously looking for a global export as well. The funding from INI came to a halt, as I say, about last year. We're in the final embers of that at the present time, but we have now received direct funding from government to deliver the Green Innovation Challenge Fund, which is fairly opposite for today. And we're also in negotiation with another government department to look at delivering their Green Gov Fund as well, so they're remarkably similar, but each department has to have a new term to show their individuality. What we hope to do with that is, if we are successful in that, as I say, previously we had funded research between TRL 3 and 7. We hope now that we'll be able to continue that, but to stretch that into 8 and 9 as well, so that we accelerate the impact of research and actually see that through to actual change in our behaviour and on our energy mix within Northern Ireland, and hopefully globally as well. Obviously, we have to do that within a context of policy which Northern Ireland creates. We have our own energy strategy, we have a green growth strategy, and more recently we decided we'd make things more difficult for ourselves by implementing a local climate bill, which was much more challenging than that set by the UK government. And a recent Climate Commission committee report would actually reference some research that CASE has undertaken. It's basically say we have some significant challenges ahead. So that's our primary focus of our funding. The type of funding we have given so far to date, we've had about £14 million worth of funding. We've we leveraged significantly about 5, 6, 7 extra million on top of that. We were also able to pull down in around £9 million or €9 million of funding to fund a sister organisation called the Brighton Centre, which was a PhD training centre, but building on the lower level TRLs. So our ambition would be to take you into primary school and bring you the whole way through, and so you can go out of big school and learn to work for yourself as an organisation, as a company. There are challenges within that. How we're structured is we have to have 3 companies participating in any particular research project. Our research projects are average about £250,000, about 24 months. We need to have 3 companies in that, as that's something that we would like to do going forward. So we're about to conduct an entire review to see, look, what's the best way of getting innovation out there. As I say, from a climate change point of view, without going on too much about it, we have to do something quickly. We have to do something whilst there's targets in Northern Ireland for 2030, and I'm sure they're replicated here. Actions need to be in place before that for those to have effect. So that's ostensibly what we do. In terms of the Challenge Fund, we're actually hoping that we will be getting more money very soon. And as I say, for us, for a learning aspect for cases, now we're having to go away from research funding, which was easy, well-trodden path. Everybody knows how to do it. We're currently have a call out at the present moment in time. Unfortunately, you have to be in Northern Ireland to, well, academics have to be in Northern Ireland to do it, which is something I was told could be a career-limiting exercise. If I go, why can't we ask Manchester University or Cardiff University to do research? And I was told, don't ask that question. But you can be a company from outside Northern Ireland, so long as your focus in terms of the development, the opportunities and the wider supply chain will benefit Northern Ireland in that regard. So as to say, we'll be looking across 4 areas. So one of them will be net zero utilities. One of them will be in the agri sector. One of them will be about energy storage. And again, there will be alternative fuels. One of the problems I identified, and I've been in post 18 months, is it was primarily very academically orientated and a degree of industry and concern. But a major failing is that there was no response to the policy architecture, or the policy architecture couldn't actually be developed in terms of how fast the emerging research was happening, particularly in the agri sector. It's a significant component of the Northern Ireland economy, but at the same time it's a significant component of the carbon dioxide, and it's also its nutrient ramifications for river water course and stuff. But we are researching, my colleague Professor David Rooney is leading a significant bit of research which is basically turning that on its head. But unless we bring the policy people with it, it'll never actually be realised. So therefore we could actually turn farming in Northern Ireland, and hopefully if we get it right there, it's easily replicated elsewhere, into a carbon sink. So therefore, rather than, as we would describe it, as the townies running out to the farmers and screaming at, oh, you must get rid of all your cows, your sheep and your chickens, despite most of them eating them, What they were actually saying to the farming community was actually you can't afford to feed your family, you can't send your daughter to university, you're basically asking to take a pay cut. So there is other ways of considering that. So if we can generate, if there's a value to carbon, and there is a value to carbon, we can quantify that value in carbon. We can actually say, well, look, you sequestered so much carbon last year. Here, augment your income with this. So it's a much easier ask, and then to go and go, well, can you reduce your herd size by 25% if I give you the same amount of income as you had last year? For most people, I know personally speaking, I'm perfectly happy to do this half the amount of work for the same amount of money. It's what innovation's all about, really, is it not? But so that's what the major component of what we do in terms of speeding up the innovation challenge is actually how we build up our networks with policy people and people who actually design policy. And it's so fantastically, because someone mentioned it, Elvira, basically, you can have all the best ideas in the world, but if they don't get out there, they're pointless. And plus the fact, one other aspect that I've implemented over the last 18 months as well, is we used to work with just basically hard-ass engineering the whole time, essentially. So we have now integrated more recently, and particularly in that area in agriculture, we've brought in the School of Management. We're looking at economic studies of that. So actually, what is the price of carbon? How does that? And more importantly, again, is that we have a significant problem in Northern Ireland, is you can't get planning for anything. It's a very small parochial area. I would imagine Wales is somewhat similar. So therefore, how do we build up the society's knowledge? Our levels of carbon literacy across all sectors of Northern Ireland are appalling. And therefore, you mentioned about people, and probably innovation literacy is exactly the same. It's very easy to talk rubbish. And if you say the right words, people actually go, God, they must know something. And I'm not saying that as I'm hugely carbon literate or I'm some form of polyglot in carbon. But no, we need to actually build that up. And that's another feature that we're designing into our centre as well. So we have to innovate as much as actually giving out money and an expectation and a demand upon industry.
Can I jump in on that point, Mark? Because there's a really important point here, because you said about educating people about innovation, and I know that everyone in this room, if you're passionate about innovation, if it's something you care about, that it's not easy to translate that all. So I'm going to take it a step back again, and I'm going to take the word challenge and challenge-led innovation. I'll start with you on this question, because what's a good challenge look like, and how do we get to a good challenge? Because in reality, most people that I work with in the public sector kind of get it, but they really don't. And so how do we get that across, and how do we develop good challenges, given these sort of variety of sectors and the context they work in?
I think it all comes down to what outcome needs to be achieved. I think it's how broad do you want it? I think that there is a bit of a. I think Kathy, you were talking about with Nesta. You start with, I suppose, quite a broad scope or number of different avenues you could go the innovation, and then you funnel it up. I think I'm trying to think with that. For example, with our net zero food fund, we did 20 projects, and actually the funders came back and said, would you like to do something similar this year? And we've gone, no, what we'd much rather do now is take 2 or 3 of the projects and actually try and scale them up now. It was almost, there's a bit of a, but I think from a challenge point of view, it's definitely that outcome piece in the first instance. Interestingly, so obviously we do these innovation vouchers, and innovation means so many different people. You go to a farm and you go, I don't do innovation. But actually, if he's doing something new in his farm, he is actually doing that. When we do an event, or we used to do in the past, you'd say, come along and get some innovation support. And you'd get 10 people turn up. And you say, okay, great, that's good. If you turn around and said, okay, learn how to reformulate your product to reduce salt, sugars and fats, you get 50 people turn up, because they're suddenly going, okay, I understand that. So it is about that definition. In order to get an outcome, if you want a much wider, broader range of something coming, then fine, keep your challenge level broad, and then the further you get up that innovation pile, the more honed you have to come in.
And I'll bounce to Kathy on this, because Kathy, you talked about, I know you do a broad range of challenges. Tell me about some of the good ones. What are the ones that when you see them come through, you know that you've got something you can deliver against, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So First, I completely agree about having a sense of what outcomes are that you want to achieve, and being quite precise in what the challenge is about, I think is really important. And I think the two can get confused sometimes, because when people think of open innovation, they think kind of, oh, let's just sort of keep it open and see what happens. We want to be open, we want to support innovation. But what we found is that doesn't actually support innovation. It just tends to confuse people. That I think you do need to be somewhat specific about not how something should be achieved, but what the outcomes are that you're looking for and what good looks like. And I think that's fair to the innovators, and that's fair to the judges, and fair for anyone who's involved in the whole process. But specifically on kind of your question of how do you know something is good, we run challenges in a couple different ways. Sometimes if we're working with a particular partner who knows what the sector is and what the topic is and is trying to hone in on that problem definition, do quite a bit of research in speaking with innovators, speaking with people in the industry, speaking with the problem holders, speaking with who's affected by this problem not being solved, to research and ensure that first the problem definition is hitting the right point, and that the types of criteria and what you'll be asking innovators to do and how you'll be incentivizing them to do that are all going to get those kind of outcomes that you need. Yeah. And then the other way that we've run challenges, especially more of our city-based or place-based challenges, I think has parallels with how the Cardiff Capital Region has run a challenge in being kind of a two-stage process of first seeking local partners, our local authorities, public sector bodies that have a problem to be solved, and then choosing specific challenges to run. The way that we did that with the Mayor of London was by doing that open call for local councils, boroughs, charities, kind of quasi-public sector agencies to put forth a problem to be solved, and then invested some time in capacity building with those that had kind of had a nugget of something and that we thought would be good to explore further. And I think in that two-stage process, having that capacity building built in, we did something similar when we ran the Climate Smart Cities Challenge, which was around global cities. And then coming up soon, we'll be launching a global transport challenge, which is going to go further in that first stage of doing that capacity building with potential cities or potential problem holders who have a transport problem to be solved. We have a sense already of some transport problems in cities that would lend themselves to good challenges insofar as the decarbonization and gender equity kind of stuff that we know we want to focus on. And I think spending that time up front, I think my bottom line is spending that time up front with the problem holders, with the challenge holders, to make sure that you're hitting kind of the right note.
Great. Elvira, I'm going to come to you in a question around about which you've looked at this space more widely, you've studied it widely. So an interesting piece around about what we do regionally or what we do hyper-locally or micro-missions, whatever we might call it. You talked about scalability before. How do we ensure that some of the challenges, for example, that we're hearing about can actually be scaled?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the issue of how you articulate the challenges. And I couldn't agree more on being very careful about framing the challenges, because in the framing of the challenge, you almost have the solution. You kind of frame the challenges and the solutions almost, how you do one will determine the other. And we tend to, be too narrow in the way we frame the challenges. Sometimes that can lead to solutionist outcomes rather than genuine kind of challenges that addresses the problems of the users. So who's the challenge owner, and how that is brought into the conversation? That's very important. How do you do that very early on, so that sends a signal to the market and so on. So having that kind of foresight capacity as well when you articulate demand is really important. And the scale kind of comes in here in that we often, I think, places often think that their problems are unique. Often they're not. And I think there is sometimes framing the problem narrowly in terms of the challenges of the place is important, and the the challenges might be specifically severe in that place, and then you can be kind of almost a lead user for solutions of that. But I think having in mind how that might be scaled up later on, if it will be relevant in terms of gathering interest for solutions. And otherwise, there's too much of a risk of fragmentation.
Yeah.
And I think in public sector, so that rather than centralizing, kind of articulating demand in a smart way that can lead to scaling up of the solutions, kind of that might be a way forward, because often what happens in the public sector is, contrary to big companies, the demand is potentially large, but it's fragmented. So you don't articulate demand sufficiently. And what happens is that the market is articulated and kind of takes advantage of that fragmentation. Whereas if you articulate demand in a smart way, either using scale or other means, you can start to save markets.
Yeah.
So scale can be used strategically to save those markets and say, well, let's see what other places have similar challenges, as you were saying.
Is it almost a case sometimes of eating at the same table as industry and
Yes.
as colleagues otherwise? And I think, Martin, I'm reflecting on what you were saying. So obviously you've had successful challenges you've delivered through. And we talked a little bit just before the session about the importance of outcomes and that outcome-driven approach. What do I do if the challenge that I have in front of me doesn't meet the needs of industry? Industry has no need for it. So what have you done, and especially in the critical space that you're working, to try and align that?
Well, first of all, I find the most important thing is to have set up regular and frequent dialogue. Now, I'm sure government over here is an awful lot different in Northern Ireland. There's the siloisation of government that makes it particularly difficult for any challenge to get, or any innovation to get through, particularly when government departments have a small salami slice of responsibility for the particular area. So what we do in that front, how we overcome that, is we design round tables for civil servants and introduce them to their respective colleagues. And basically, we get them to talk through the shared challenges. So for example, every government department in Northern Ireland has the problem with the Climate Act. It's a prism through which they now, so if it is a health service or communities or whatever else, it's very obvious that where that would sit within our environment and agriculture. But for how do the other ones see their role in it? So dialogue is fundamentally important. Where we see it working really well, for example, is that we funded a piece of research about how you would decarbonise the gas grid in Northern Ireland. It just so happens we did something right in Northern Ireland. We put in a gas infrastructure, which allows us to keep hydrogen and various other bits and pieces. But we actually found that if we captured all the slurries and the grass silage, the waste grass silage, so we weren't competing with food production, very important, we could actually decarbonise 82% of the gas grid, existing gas grid, and which is very interesting because with methane, which is roughly the same gas that people use at present time, and interestingly enough, or serendipitously enough, that's basically the mix 80-20. When you substitute in the hydrogen, you could actually But then the problem was, then people go, well, what's the price injection point for biomethane? And we're going, well, stop focusing in on biomethane because we're trying to create, someone mentioned earlier about a circular economy. If we build large-scale biorefineries, biomethane only becomes one strand of that. And therefore, actually, there's a feedback loop. If we can make our own fertilizers, so therefore you can actually make your own biomethane cheaper. But then there's the nutrient aspect. But it's actually trying to get people, both industry and government, to understand the rapid pace of change within that. And also to translate it. I mean, I'm not an academic. I see myself, if anybody read a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, as some form of babblefish. I studied it for a very long time, and then I worked in behaviour change in the public arena. So understanding how you say things to different audiences is greatly important in that regard. But getting back to your point, as I say, creating a framework or an architecture that allows innovation to succeed, and making sure that people get information bloody quickly.
Great, that's perfect. So look, I'm gonna bring a point in here I'm going to be deliberately sort of poke the bears a little bit. So you are talking about the successful challenge programs you've seen in place. Elvira, you've seen them nationally, internationally. What are the mistakes? Because we must have had a few on the road. And do any of you want to speak to particular situations you've seen where I get fast fail, but we're getting less forgiving government these days? So, Howell, from your point of view, for example, do you think you've made mistakes in the past, or you've seen them where you think we've got to be honest about them?
Well, I was saying about that workforce development funding earlier, and even if a company came to me and asked me, I wouldn't be absolutely clear with the parameters of where they were. I think I'm probably slightly moving away from the point, but I think one of the important things is having really good partnerships going on, and whether you're talking about with the funders, having those dialogues that are going on, whether it's about others. Don't pretend to be the expert in the room sometimes. So we partner for the healthy product one we've got at the moment with Food and Drink Federation Scotland, because they're the ones out there who understand the issues around nutrition and so on. And it's the same with Nesta. They worked on a food one that's around gamification. So they worked with InGame, who are the sort of gaming innovation centre up in Dundee. So I sometimes think don't pretend to be something, because actually if you're not understanding the industry or understanding both the demand side and the supply side, it can go very wrong, and you're going to get undersubscribed. You're not going to get the traction, the companies, or not just the companies, but the innovation coming through and the outcomes coming through from that as well. So I think probably, if that's again, just partnership, really.
Absolutely. And Kathy, from your point of view, you'll talked about a lot of programs again. What would be the lessons that you've learned on this journey?
Yeah, two things come to mind. One of them is around underinvesting in that upfront research. I think there's often a sense of urgency, and we share that internally in my team, and wanting to sort of get things going. Let's get off the ground, let's put out this challenge, let's get people coming in. And I think time and time again we've learned that you do need to spend that time during the upfront research, like I was talking about, building in enough time in your timelines to be realistic for how long that's going to take and other elements are going to take before you can even launch. And building back on that point about the stakeholders, I think that's really important too. I'd say we have some challenges where it's almost fortuitous that it's sort of worked out, but looking back, there are a number of instances where I think building up some stakeholders would be useful. I'll talk about one example with the place-based challenge again. So Mombasa County, Kenya, we're running a Mombasa County Plastics Innovation Prize, which builds off a kind of a larger prize that we're running in sub-Saharan Africa around plastic recycling and pulling marine plastic, routing it through different means. But specifically ran an offshoot of that prize in Mombasa County. And it's worked out fine, but we didn't initially have the county on board, and it was kind of run through a larger funder, an international donor, who wanted to make this happen for various reasons, wanted to do it in Mombasa. And then the local government came along for the ride, and they were happy to come along for the ride. But in retrospect, obviously it would have been much better if it had been a bit more intentional about how those conversations started out in the first place. And the risk was that, in another place, maybe that wouldn't have gone so well. And knowing that local landscape, knowing the local stakeholders, having your local partnerships engaged from the beginning is something that we know, and that we would continue to emphasize with any partner in any sector that you're working in.
Great. I've got a couple more questions, but I'm conscious of time, and I want to open up to the floor to see if we've got any questions from anyone at all. Please.
Thank you. So, Mark Briggs, Cardiff and Vale Health Board again. Thanks for that. Some really interesting discussion. But I'd like to ask the panel. We've got academic and we've got practical experience out in the field about risk and risk appetite. So in the private sector, the most innovative individuals and companies they fail probably more often than they succeed. And yet in the public sector, the public, the press and politicians expect perfection. So how are we going to manage this? So we've got great challenges. How do you manage your risk portfolio about who you back? And how do we learn from that? And how do we try and educate the public that we're not wasting the public purse, but sometimes you've got to take a punt?
It's a great question, Mark.
And how do we do that within healthcare? Because you've got people's lives.
Yeah.
I have a couple of thoughts. I'm happy to start.
Please do. Yeah.
So that's a really good question, something I've thought about a lot also. I think there's a couple ways. I think, first of all, with risk for the funder, I mean, that is a very true risk that they could end up awarding the prize money and then the company might fold a year or two later. That happens. I think ways to mitigate that risk are in setting really clear criteria for what good looks like, and having that stage gate approach where you're kind of working with the innovators on this journey, so you're getting to know the companies and building their capacity to go on to have success. So I think there's a lot of ways you can mitigate that with building that into the criteria, building that into the support functions. But at the end of the day, it is still a risk, and it can happen. And we've seen that happen in challenges that we've run, that years later the companies, went in another path. So one way is to mitigate is through the things I mentioned. Another way to mitigate that is by attaching some kinds of requirements to the final challenge award. I mean, a true prize is just a reward money, and in theory, companies could do whatever they want with it. Most of the challenges that we've run with most partners, they usually want to attach some kind of requirements to that, of how that funding is spent, and some kind of tracking and monitoring, maybe not as onerous as a grant program, but still have some kinds of safeguards in place that can be built in. But then the third way I would think about it for funders is at the end of the day, like I mentioned before, a prize or a challenge is a good way to leverage funding and get a lot of people working on something, get a lot of companies putting in their own money, getting companies to invest their own resource and their own time into something that can help to offset any kind of financial output that, say, the funder is putting into it. But I'm curious to see what other people's thoughts might be.
Any other thoughts? Go ahead, Howell.
I think with us, it is sometimes that risk. So with the inward investment, we've done 15 projects over the last year and a half. We've had to go back to Scottish Government to try and, not justify, but try and show the worth of them. So we put in customer service journeys for all our innovation vouchers. 6 months after the project finishes, they do a survey monkey, and they complete on where they are with impacts. And, they find that's the economic impacts around processes, service, and new products and all that. But what I've been doing with these funds is I've been getting one of the team to ring them up and interview them for half an hour, partly to see if there's a case study there and actually get the bare bones for a case study that we can then push out, which is going to help that piece. But partly as well to see what other impacts, and whether, because the 5 or 10K, it's only going to take you so far, and you've got to you've got to acknowledge it's never going to get you that full-on prototype that's going out to market. So actually, are they now going for UKRI funding? Have they got a knowledge transfer partnership in place? Something like that, that it's actually then about that journey. But at the moment, it's probably 4 out of those 15 inward investment where they've registered an office in Scotland, or there's boots on the ground, or they're doing a KTP. So they're the successes, and sort of saying that's pretty good at the moment. After a year and a half, that's a pretty good return on investment in some ways. Well, I certainly think it is. It's not going into the massive inward investment plans that Scottish Development International are looking at, for example, but actually in terms of what we're starting to affect, and for that 150,000 that the Scottish Government are giving us at the moment, it's a success. But some of them, they've taken the learning, and they're never ever going to come to Scotland. We just have to accept that. But it's helped the universities as well, or it's helped societies. So
that's great. Very good question. We've got 2 more questions. We're going to ask the organisers if I can borrow 5 minutes extra, if that's okay. Yeah, because I've started a wee bit later, so I'm going a bit selfish. So we've got 3 more questions, actually. We'll start at the back, if that's okay. Can we get a microphone?
I've got the microphone.
There you go.
Hello, Gordon Brown. I'm Decarbonisation Project Manager for Transport for Wales. I think what Howell's just brought up was possibly the same question I was going to ask. We do all this innovation. There's been talk about the fact that we don't do, but we do. We're sat in a brilliant building here that probably had quite a lot of innovation that's gone completely by the way. But actually, do we actually go back and measure enough? Do we actually ask that question, to actually have that proof? And do we measure everything beyond just a case study? Because often what I've learned has been because I've got something wrong.
That's great. Great question. Monitoring and evaluation, we could have a wee separate side party about that. But I genuinely, there's a really critical part. We're being held to account. Who would like to take that? Elvira, any thoughts on that initially?
Yes, I mean, and you're right, that's connected to the previous question, and I was, I think, connected to the comment on learning from experience and demonstrating that things work, and I think this is how you kind of reduce the risk a little bit. So you start with one case and then demonstrate the outcomes of that, and then that's taken up subsequently because then we saw that in the case of Galicia when we were looking at that, where they're starting with a small project in health, well, kind of smallish project funded by structural funds, and then that kind of went very well. They saw the outcomes for the public sector in terms of cost reduction, better results, and so on. And then other parts of public sector, okay, well, these tools are useful. Let's do some more kind of public procurement, design competitions, and so on. But also for firms where they saw, actually, this is a really good opportunity for us to gain contracts, to gain, to innovate, to subsequently go to other markets. And companies were saying, well, actually, the first contract is much more useful than the last grant, because that's how you kind of get things into the market. So reducing risk that way and demonstrating. And part of that is, of course, having a good evidence base. And you're right, there's a lot of innovation, but often that doesn't travel well. There's a lot of kind of not invented here kind of syndrome. So a lot of local authorities, they have this amazing thing, and then but that's not taken up by anybody else. Why is that? So there's not enough of kind of learning from each other and not enough kind of collaborative working. And I think one potential, which is a little bit untapped in this kind of challenge-driven initiatives, is the networking and partnerships, because in order to address these challenges, you have to form partnerships. And we saw in Galicia how that was driving a lot of networking from firms, and firms and universities coming together to address these challenges, but also big firms working with the small firms, so beyond these kind of little projects. And also kind of partnerships with the public sector and end users. But that doesn't happen enough. I think there is a kind of resistance to collaboration. But in a way, the urgency of the problems and the scale of the problems should enable that. So how you give that push, I think that's really important. And also how do you evidence the results? I think that goes back to discussions I had with Ian Broderson on SBRI, that you can evidence the effects on firms, but we don't know how that's having an impact on public sector outcomes and so on. So we need better evidence base to take this forward as well.
We probably don't. I could recommend you speak to Martin also, because we had a quick chat about that, about this changing the lens of what we monitor, what we evaluate, and how. We did have two more questions. Can we just at the back, I think 3 questions, but we go here.
Sorry.
Either or.
Thank you, Lewis Dean from the Wales Innovation Network. I wanted to ask around how you ensure diversity in the innovators that you're attracting to challenges. You clearly want to attract people who are willing to take risks, but how do you ensure that you're actually getting quite a broad range of perspectives into those challenges?
Kathy, do you want to speak to that?
I can start with one. So we found having lots and lots of outreach networks is really helpful. That our one team kind of can't do it all. So depending on where the challenge is located, what the eligibility is, if it's local, global, or what have you, and where we're targeting groups, is by building those partnerships with networks that can help to be a credible voice to contacting entrants that we want to be aware of the challenge and want to enter it. So they're hearing about it from kind of a credible organization and can get kind of an intro that way. The other thing that we try to do is make it kind of low barrier to entry. We do a simple application form. We try not to make it like an onerous kind of grant application format, and doing lots of one-to-one support to innovators who have questions beforehand, helping with developing out their applications, those kinds of things. But I think before you get to those two things, you have to first have those partnerships with those networks who can help encourage diverse entrants to even become aware of it.
It's critical these days as well, and certainly what we're judged on. So please.
Robbie Davison from a company called Belfast. I'll be speaking at a workshop this afternoon. Interestingly, there's a couple of colleagues talked about how do you get innovation into practice and talked about the circular economy. We'll be talking about that this afternoon. I'm not plugging the workshop that I'm in. I just wanted to raise that as a commentary. I'll tell you what's really interesting for me is listening to everybody on the panel. Elvira, you said before that sometimes innovation takes some time. I would say that the company that I set up 17 years ago has been innovative throughout, and we have raised and spent about £12 million getting to where we are now. And the bit that has always kind of flummoxed me, and we don't enter challenge-led programs anymore, and I tell you for why. Along the journey, size has always mattered. You see, so we were never big enough to tackle the problem that we said we were going to tackle. And actually now we're big enough. What's interesting is we're getting on with it. But it took us so many years to get here. And because we were not big enough, that size disaggregated the innovation that we were bringing to the table. And hey-ho, we are proving that innovation right now. So how do you solve the problem of size matters? Because I've not seen it yet, interestingly.
Martin, you wanted to respond to that one. You pass the microphone there, if that's okay.
Well, within case, size doesn't matter. And we have specific criteria for companies to join in, no matter what your size. And so, I mean, if you're entering a case program, you have to pay some money towards the funding. Basically, that's to make sure that you've got a vested interest in seeing the program through to manage risk, I suppose, of failure. But we don't see that, and in fact, because Northern Ireland is an SME economy, it would be ludicrous to actually contemplate putting a size thing. And it actually it's quite a good program. We have, say, small, medium, and large companies can participate, but getting that entire supply chain working together actually helps alleviate. So it is something that we have actively addressed, and it's probably one of the ones you could look for an example of best practice that you can overcome that. So,
with a three more questions from the floor, so hands going up. But if it's okay, I think we'll need to wrap up at that point. Look, can I just say a really sincere thank you to our four panelists. They will be around all day, and I'm volunteering their services. So if you wish to come and have a chat at any point, please do. But can we give a round of applause for our panelists?